Hello, my name is Janet O'Sullivan and I work at HEC Alumni, and I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you to this webinar that we offer in collaboration with HEC Executive Education. Now, there are about 45 participants registered for the webinar, and I say we're delighted to see that there are participants not just in Paris, but all over France and indeed all over the world. So before we begin, I'd just like to give you a few guidelines, technical guidelines. Your microphones will be muted for the webinar, but that doesn't mean you can't interact. In fact, you can use the chat box, which is at the bottom right of your screen. Please use it if you have any questions during the session. Our speaker, Etienne, we'll deal with the questions probably in a bulk at the end of the seminar, at the end of the webinar. Probably the last 10 to 15 minutes will be devoted to questions. So keep your questions coming as they occur. And of course, we hope there will be no technical difficulties, but if you do have any problems seeing or perhaps even hearing the webinar, don't hesitate to let us know during the webinar via this chat box, and our technical team can help you out. That's all I have to say with regard to the technical guidelines. So let's get started. I'm in very good company today. I'd like to introduce you to Etienne Kreger, who is a great personality around campus because he's the scientific director of our Entrepreneurship Center, which is really something that's very important and very exciting happening at HEC. But I'll let him tell you all about that. Welcome, Etienne, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Janet, and welcome to this webinar on entrepreneurial teams. And before all, many thanks to my colleagues involved in the organization of this webinar. Without them, this initiative would simply not exist. So a few words about myself. As Janet told, I'm an HEC alumni. I graduated from the Grande École a long time ago, and I also hold a PhD. And I'm affiliate professor. I founded a program for training and executive education program for tech entrepreneur called Challenge Plus, which is a quite successful program where we followed hundreds of entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs. Some of those companies got public, some of them were acquired, and we have we interact with hundreds of very successful entrepreneurs. I myself, I'm an entrepreneur. I co-founded some companies. I'm currently co-founder and CFO of a biotech company. It's a long way creating and developing such companies. I'm also board member of other companies, and I'm the representative of HEC for the Paris-Saclay Seed Fund, which is a venture capital and seed fund, 50 million euro seed fund created by HEC and École Polytechnique. BPI France, and I also offer the numerous business tools, financial engineering and modeling Excel tools that I sometimes use to teach entrepreneurial finance. That's all about me, and let's go directly to the question. So creating a winning team often looks like finding a 5-legged sheep. This is obviously a real challenge, and the aim of this conference is to help you clarify the debate and to avoid some huge mistakes. So let's first see the results of our recent questionnaire about typical startups and the key components of a winning team. So the first question was about an iconic entrepreneur, and most of you quote American entrepreneurs, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, but also Xavier Niel, François Pinault, and someone even told the most iconic entrepreneur was his mom. So thanks a lot for that. Same thing for typical iconic startups, also famous American startups, other Airbnb, Google, but also BlaBlaCar, Criteo, David De Vialet. So America does not have the monopoly of archetypical startups. That's for typical startups. And in your mind, what's mainly an entrepreneur? So the question was, is it mainly a risk taker, a deal maker, a problem solver, a money maker, a visionary, a rule breaker, or a modern hero? It appears for you that an entrepreneur is mainly a risk taker, you obviously take risks, but it's also a problem solver. Without any problem, there is no need for entrepreneurship. It's also a visionary, a money maker. You have to generate cash flows, otherwise you're dead, and a rule breakers. And very few of you say it's a deal maker. So according to this questionnaire, Donald Trump would not be really an entrepreneur, but he's a deal maker. Okay. You are also more or less optimistic because 22% of the respondents say that there are more opportunities than risks, but 75% of you say there are as many opportunities as risks. And if risk is defined as the standard deviation of return, since you have return or since you have a given state, you have the risk to fail, to lose everything, but there is also what is called an upside risk, which is the risk to succeed a lot. But you are more or less optimistic, and there are only 3% of the respondents that said that there are more risks than opportunities. You are also interested in creating or joining startups, which explains why you are here today, because more than 50% of the participants are intend to create or to join a startup or already have created or joined one. And so what are, according to you, the main components of a dream team? You consider then that it's mainly team spirit and solidarity for almost 50%, but also common objectives, passion, you are passionate, and complementary skills. That's interesting. We'll go through that afterwards. Concerning the ideal number of founding partners, you agree that creating a startup is not often a one-man show or a one-woman show, and the issue is to gather 2 partners or 3 partners. So for you, the issue is to find another partner or 2 other partners, and it's not a Mexican army where you have to find a dozen of partners. So it's an issue of finding complementary skills, and we'll go back to that afterwards. So the average number of founding partners is 2.5 persons. And if we go back to equity sharing, which is also, of course, an important issue, the average of equity you get, of initial equity, you consider that the CEO should get 53%, and even the smallest associate partner should get, on average, 13%. And believe me, I would have loved to be the smallest founding partner of Google or Facebook. Unfortunately, it was not the case, but we'll see with the research I conducted with one of my students that you are quite close to the reality, and the smallest partner has also an important chunk of a startup, especially if this startup succeeds, it can make a lot of money. So we also asked questions about deal breakers, and here your answer about the main deal breaker shows different results than the main components of a winning team. Since, for instance, you say 15% of you say an unfair or an unmotivated percentage of equity would be a deal breaker. Of course, if you have no common objectives, unsurprisingly, this could be a deal breaker. No commitment, also a deal breaker, and no team spirit and no solidarity. So these are the 4 main factors that will make you quit a deal or not creating a startup. So let's go back to the research I did with an HEC Grande École student that wrote his professional thesis. We made a survey on 166 entrepreneurs of the Challenge Plus program, but also entrepreneurs incubated at our HEC incubator that is currently located at Station F. as you know, and the results are the same as you told. So you see that entrepreneurship is seldom a one-man show or a one-woman show. So only one person among eight creates a company as a single shareholder, and it's also not a Mexican army, since 72% of people create with 2 or 3 partners. So the issue is which partner, how can I find them? The everlasting challenge is the following. Each startup may be different, but the challenge of finding complementary skills is almost always the same. You start with a business or a technical background, and you have a business or a startup idea. The trouble is that 5% only of the success will be due to an outstanding strategy, and this strategy has to be clear, has to be really, there should be an excellent value proposition, but 95% of your success will be ascribed to execution. And there you need a lot of talents: marketing, sales, industrialization, intellectual property, finance, lobbying. And so you have to you have to work with the best people as fast as possible, and you don't have the money to compensate them, and you don't even have the money to pay yourself at the beginning. So the issue becomes the following. You have to find 1 or 2 complementary persons, technical person if you are a business person, or business people if you are a technical person. In fact, the 4 key skills are the following. You should need a visionary, you should need a deal maker, a marketing and sales person who is obsessed by making deals. You should need what I call an engineer in charge of research and development and manufacturing and quality. If you are not able to manufacture a product, lots of very interesting ideas end up with companies losing money or having no customers or very angry customers. And you also need what I call a back office Shiva. So a person in charge of creating processes, administrative processes, optimizing that, of getting money, being in charge of logistics and support. So you have to gather those 4 skills, and at the beginning it will be carried out by 2 or 3 persons. So another way to state it is you have to attract founders, and we defined it, some complementary founders, complementary in terms of skills and in terms of temper. You have to attract employees, but early employees, you have to pay them, and you should get the help of advisors. So how are those people defined? I simply use the definition of Jean-Baptiste Rudel, who is the founder and CEO of Criteo, and he recently created another startup. So he defines founders with the following items. Founders are dedicated full-time to the project. They are committed for staying several years to develop the company. They work without any pay until the first fundraising, and so they accept the risk of failing to raise such funds. This is a founder. If you want to get some money, if you want to be paid, you wish to join the project full-time, but you will be an early employee. You will get stock options, but as we will see, you cannot get a pay and be treated as a real founder who takes a huge risk, and who also takes the risk of working a lot, which is another component of startups. And the third part is contributors, so all those who have contributed to by their time or expertise to the project, but who have other professional activities. So how does this mix into a company? First, how can I find those people? How can I find the ideal partners and create the best team? So networking is really everything. Use professional network. The HEC network is a very huge network. We have 56,000 alumni. This is an impressive network to attract talent, to find money, to find customers. So you can also use other networks if you create a company with a Polytechnic alumni or with a Paris Saclay researcher. So networking is very important, and you may use your existing academic network. You can also use social networks. I know entrepreneurs that use very precisely social network like LinkedIn, or who advertise on French web to identify specific talents, even CTOs. If you didn't find a CTO at the beginning, you have some events like Adopt a CTO, and we have also created on the campus what we call Saclay Pitch Nights with our friends of École Polytechnique. So sometimes we do it at HEC, sometimes we do it on the Polytechnique's campus, where entrepreneurs pitch their projects in front of, let's say, 50 other people. And at the end, you just get a beer and a cold pizza, and people enjoy that, not especially the cold pizza, but the beer, and they network, and sometimes they decide discussing further and create a startup. And of course, incubators and innovation clusters are an excellent ecosystem where you can find complementary people. At our incubator, some people stop the project and decide to work with somebody else. So networking is everything. As I say in this slide, it's a crucial issue. It's a very inefficient. It's not efficient at this stage, and we try to maximize the interactions with complementary people on the Saclay Plateau and in other areas and ecosystems. That's why we started several initiatives, and I'm very concerned about developing this kind of interactions in order to help you find your ideal partner. So this is the question about how I find this partner. The other result of my research with Thomas Litté about equity sharing showed that, in fact, the technical component is as important as the commercial component. There was even a slight premium for the technical component, but I suspect that most respondents were engineers. But it's about, if we look at the amount of capital, of initial equity, research and development plus production represents 38%, whereas commercial and marketing represents 36%. Finance is 12%, so you should get, as a CFO, 12% of the initial equity. And a huge surprise for me was the CEO is only a function that gets 14%. In reality, if you start with a technical background or with a business background, if you are the CEO, you will get the CEO premium, plus you will be in charge of business development and marketing. But as we see, the everlasting challenge is to find a complementary skill, plus this administrative and finance stuff. And so if we look at the equity percentage according to the number of associates, if it's a two-person game at the beginning, it's a bit 60-40. But even if you have 5 partners, the smallest partner gets about 10%. So it's very close to the number you quoted yourself. And believe me, if you get 10% of a company that will ultimately be sold for more than 10 million euros, it's a fair amount of money. And it's not only a question of money, it's also a question of power and of deciding together. So if we go back to Jean-Baptiste Rudel's very interesting article on the Gallion Project website. He found with his survey on 70 entrepreneurs that more than 50% of the founders choose an unequal capital allocation, and he found that such an allocation has a higher chance of success in terms of valuation and exit value. And he also found that the egalitarians regret their choice afterwards, saying, well, it was the worst decision, the silliest decision I made. He also notes that a majority of venture capitalists prefer an unequal allocation. So 50-50 is really a problem. I can develop that if you want afterwards. And full-time founders, people involved full-time, should get a huge chunk, a huge majority of the startup, according to Jean-Baptiste Rudel, more than 85%. And all the other contributors who have another job should get less than 15%. Recently, I was proposed 10% of equity by an entrepreneur, and I refused because I say it was silly, it was irrelevant, it would not be a service to accept that. So remember that an individual contributor should not get more than 5%, and full-time founders taking the risk of not being paid, taking the risk of failing, of not raising funds, should get a huge chunk of the company. And the allocation among founders can be solved through discussion and some templates. I can share Excel templates with you. You can also find a very interesting template on the Gallion Project website, and this very interesting article of Jean-Baptiste Rudel. Okay, but of course, it's sometimes a bit more complicated. You have other conceptions. For instance, I really admire the founders of Big Mama. Big Mama is one of the most impressive startup for the last 10 years, according to me. 3 years afterwards, those two guys have created 420 jobs, have opened 6 restaurants, generate more than 30 million revenues. But first of all, they wanted to create something together. They wanted to share something together, so I suspect it's a 50-50 deal, and it was not, the business idea was not even existing. It was not this outstanding concept of pizzerias. They wanted to do something else. So that's another logic, which is also an interesting one. Another one with also a very successful entrepreneur, Jacques Levinaire. This person has filed more than 1,000 patents. He's the first private patent holder. He says if you develop a rocket science company, CEO is a function. I'm okay with that, and this person should get at the end about 20% of the equity, but only after a few years. So it's the logics of stock options and progressive vesting. And you have some other entrepreneurs who are more akin to this one-man show logic, who say in some cases you don't need an associate, you can run many businesses with good utens. That's what he did. So sometimes he said you don't need an associate, you don't need a partner, you can be the boss, but well, you have to choose the kind of life you want. It's another pressure, and you have to invent a company which corresponds to your psychology. So if we go back now to this team issue, regardless to the last logic, there is an African saying that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So, but with whom can I go together? And let's see now what are the main criteria to secure your association. So you have to consider skill sets and psychological profiles. There is no benefit to work with clones. You have to find complementary skills and complementary tempers. You also have to consider people who have an innovation spirit and intellectual agility. You will pivot a lot of times, often, and so better choose open-minded and pragmatic people, knowing that your project will change, evolve again and again before finding the way to succeed. You also have to consider your personal environment and your partner's personal environment and address money issues. You have to take time to know each other. It is completely unwise to avoid asking personal or even intimate questions, since you need to know the needs of your potential partners. In France, we are often uncomfortable with to discuss money issues, whereas it's a key element. If your partner has to pay expensive studies for his 3 children while you are completely free to invest, you have to know it and you have to discuss all the options. So, of course, you have to align the vision and the objectives for the short term as well as for the long term. And my colleague Anne-Claire Ledbridge, with whom I prepared this webinar, she's a coach, and we like to use the metaphor of the 3 stone carvers to illustrate that. So the first one just wants to earn his living. The second person wants to become the best stone carver in the country. And the third plans to build a cathedral. So clarify your own goals and see if they fit. And you also have to address worst case scenarios. It's not being pessimistic, it's simply anticipating complications in order to deal with conflicts. If you do it, if you anticipate these scenarios in a constructive manner, it will help you to create bonds and to grow and to succeed. So even if we rarely like it, conflict is actually healthy, because we cannot only stay nice, we also need to be true. So you have to cultivate synergies and antagonism. And Bruce Tuckman, who is an American psychologist specialized in group dynamics, explains that a team has to go through several steps to build team cohesion in order to become performant. So first, according to this specialist, comes the forming, where people start working together in a quite polite manner, avoiding the wave. After this honeymoon period, people show who they really are, as it occurs in a couple, and face the first issues and conflicts. And here comes the storming step. Then, in order to grow, the team has to build rules in order to regulate the way you operate and communicate. And this is the norming step. And then comes the performing step, with mature people able to assert themselves with respect and intellectual agility to perform. So it's a bit like a jazz band, where you have to have very different people who like to play together, who are excellent in playing together, and there will be a natural leader who will be in charge of creating this team spirit, but considering his partners as being equal. So it's very subtle, and I really appreciate this metaphor of jazz bands. So if we take a checklist, often entrepreneurs say our team is the best. Is it really the case? I'd like to share that with you in order to anticipate some tricky situations, because I see hundreds of startups, and sometimes people simply did not address some simple key issues. So do you and your associate master the key competencies? That's quite easy to assess, but if you don't address that, you're simply dead. Sometimes you have another issue with people who are loners. That can be good to succeed, to enter HEC Grande École, but you have people who are simply unable to work with a team. And if it's not the case, perhaps it's not a good founder. It can be a good expert, but probably not a good founder. I also experienced some indirectly, of course, some situations where some associates were drunkards or completely psychotic associates. So the number of people who are completely normal is not very is not huge. You sometimes have meet really weak people, and if these weak people are your associates, you will really face some problems. There is another issue that we often see with engineers. They are in love with that technology, but technology without the market has no sense. So techno addicts who are unable to be market oriented. So you have to train them, you have to push them to follow our executive education programs or EMBA programs. But everybody has to be obsessed by business development, by marketing, and that's one of the characteristics of the Silicon Valley startups that I know quite well because I'm also a board member of a Silicon Valley startup. There is another issue which is a real cancer for startups, but even for students working in groups. Lazy associates unable to work hard. That's simply not possible in a startup. Recently, I discussed with the co-founder of Point Vision Group, who is an EMBA, François Pellen. He said, when I was vice president of Pfizer, I thought I was at the max working until 11 o'clock in the evening, but now I'm working until 1 o'clock in the morning, and it's a lot of work. Never forget that. So if you have a lazy associate, even if it's a genius, I think you will really want to get rid of him or her. So please check that. And of course, avoid love affairs on the workplace. I will not detail, but check twice before getting really married with your partners. So there is another issue I want to address, which is what happens if an associate leaves your startup, or if you decide to leave your startup. So this is a well-known deal with venture capitalists. They will address it. Even some business angels will address it. And the principle is simple. If you leave the company a few months after inception, you should give back all your shares. And so it's a reverse vesting scheme. And the principle is the following. I will share that in the slides we'll get. This has been validated by an attorney. And the principle is simple. If one of us leaves the company within 5 years, say 4, you can say 2, but generally it's 5 years. It's a long range. This person will give back to all the other founders all of his or her shares, less 1/5 of these shares per year since inception. And this sale will be carried out at nominal value, not the last post-money valuation. At nominal value, that's nothing. So a pro rata basis of the shares held by all the other co-founders. If you share that, even if you don't sign a contract, if you agree per email, it's a contract, it's a deal, and you don't have to avoid that. You have to address that. It's an important money issue, and it's not only money, it's power. You will not simply not continue working if one of your partners leaves the company and say, hey, I'm keeping my shares. So you have to address that. And so, according to our experience of entrepreneurial sparring partner, Claire Ledbridge as a coach, and myself as having met about more than 800 entrepreneurs, we think the key ingredients of a dream team, of the dream recipe based on our experience is the following: a restricted number of people, definitely, complementary skills, true engagement, so people really involved in developing the business more than simply talk and good intentions, common goals. Do you want to earn your living, or do you want to build a cathedral? Do you have an outstanding ambition? Also, solidarity and collective approach based on the rules you will have to build thanks to the storms I talked about. passion, pleasure, and humor, communication, and as a result of all the previous ingredients, trust. I made a PhD on trust, and trust is a bet on the competence, on the intention of your partner, and trust is never given eternally. It has to be checked, and it has to be nurtured. So another issue I also developed in other articles is can you and your partner align the 4 planets? So what the Japanese call your ikigai, so your purpose, what will lead you to the joy of life. So crossing, merging what you are good at, what the world needs, what you love, and what you can be paid for. And believe me, even this morning, I discussed with an EMBA students, entrepreneurship can be a good way to find your ikigai, but you have to know what you want and to find what the world needs and what you can also be paid for. Some of you may prefer entrepreneurship, but you will also face major team issues. Your choice will depend on what drives you and what frightens you, as shown on this picture, where I identify 7 different items: freedom, risk. It's not avoiding risk. Some people consider that no risk, no fun. Intellectual challenge, which is very important for researchers, for instance. Reward, workload, and pressure. It's a huge pressure to create a startup. The quality of interaction and having an impact. So know yourself, so you will be able to invent, to discover the business of the activity you want to be in. Another thing I already developed, also developed in other articles, is it time to innovate? Most of you, according to the survey we made, are between 30 and 40 years, and that's the good age to create. Of course, there are also very young entrepreneurs. We have students, HEC students that create their company on the campus. That's why we adapted all our follow-up process with office hours, with new elective programs. But the average age to create a startup is 38 years. And generally, you begin facing the midlife crisis, and you will ask yourself the questions of making sense before often making money, because it's only making money is generally only the 3rd or the 4th criteria. And creating something with somebody who also has the same dilemmas requires that you address all the questions I talked about previously. And so, to conclude, you probably need to know yourself. Coaching may be good in order to help you know yourself. You have to define your personal and your professional risk threshold. You may trust. You have to trust. Without trust, there is no life. You cannot interact with people. But you also have to check to verify, because people don't sometimes only really reveal themselves with the time. And so I advise you to work with associates at least 6 months before inception, before creating the company. So there is also another consideration. It's a shaky balance between money and ideas. Sometimes money has the power. No, there is a lot of money, and nowadays ideas has the power. But ideas put into movement with a lot of work. And so beyond strategic and financial plan, it's always a human adventure. Venture capitalist team like Partech Ventures say that 75% of the weighting of the assessment of a startup company is the team. So it's absolutely crucial. I also advise you to hold, if it's not the case, various executive positions. Take board memberships, be member of strategic advisory boards, of scientific boards. That will give you a lot of experience. Of course, develop your network. Networking is everything, and HEC network is huge. And of course, be realistic, but also pursue your utopias. And I think we are done and we are perfectly on time. So do you have some questions? Let's look at the questions. It would be interesting if there is a trend in the success in startups in terms of number of partners. Do startups with 2 partners do better in the long term as those with more partners or only one? The answer is startups with 1 partner are simply not financed. If we define startups as companies, innovative companies with high growth, it's simply a deal breaker. A one-man show will not be financed. So you may create some SMEs with simple processes, but the interesting question would be, that could be an interesting research question, compare companies, startups created by 2 partners or 3 partners. I don't have the answer. We have to check. That could be another research where we could do a regression to explain the success in terms of fundraising or in terms of valuation with dependent variables of being the number of founding partners. So Douglas asks, what would be the threshold time period for success for each partner number? First, what's success? Is it getting some financing? Is it being cash flow positive? But simply remember that it's more a marathon than a sprint. It takes time. For tech startups, it's years. Of course, you won't work 5 years without any compensation, but it sometimes takes 2 years without getting any compensation. So if you have non-employment insurance, it's good, but you have to run a marathon. Isabel, what if one of the associates is funding most of the company? But still not working full-time in the startup? Should he get only 50% of the equity? At the beginning, it's not a question of money. Most entrepreneurs create a SIS, a limited company with an initial capital of 2K or 10K. And even if I have 100K or more on my bank account, you will not give me 75% of the company. At the beginning, the equity sharing is not an issue of money. It's an issue of relative implication. And so it's really not a question of money. It's the weighting I addressed before. So it's important to have a CTO, a tech guy, who will be able to develop the product and industrialize it and monitor it and manage the team. It's important to have a business developer, a marketing guy, able to find the first customers. And it's not because you are rich or you are poor. As I said, often our students, they have loans, they have to pay that back, they have not a lot of money, so they create a company sometimes even with 2000K, and then they find love money, friends, fools, and family, they find business angels, they find seed funds, but at the beginning it's not a question of money. And if somebody is not full-time involved, that's the example I quoted. You can be an advisor, you can be an excellent advisor, an excellent expert, but you should not get more than 5%. This is an exception. I see some exceptions in tech companies. Okay, you have to address that, but you have to discuss that. But if you have full-time people working hard and that they even get 20% of the shares, that doesn't work. It's a kind of employee. It's not an entrepreneur. So entrepreneurs have to have a huge incentive, a huge sense of freedom, a huge autonomy. So the other solutions often create some problems. Would you have a good template, Isabel, to recommend for a satisfactory associates pact? Yeah, shareholder agreement. I really recommend this website. If you type Gallian project on Google, these are web entrepreneurs. You will find again Pierre Kosciuszko, Boris. I really love this guy because he's impressive, he's generous. And they gathered, these people created this Galleon project association because they love kite surfing. And then they created lots of resources on this website about initiatives, about equity reputation. And they also created a template, which is a very flexible template created by, I think, two prominent law firms. And this is an excellent shareholder agreement, and about 20 venture capital firms have agreed on this framework. And I would say if some VCs don't agree with this framework, it's a real risk. And so this one is an excellent one. So the term sheet, the Galleon project term sheet is simply excellent. And it's flexible enough to address some issues. I even had some discussions with Pierre Kosciusko-Morizet about these bad liver clauses. What if somebody leaves the company? So you have to address that. But it's definitely an excellent framework. It's in English, and it will help you address all that. And it's not only raising money, it's not only an issue of valuation. That would be simple. It's also an issue of monitoring the relationship, and all that has to be addressed in that famous shareholder agreement. So it's, Douglas, could you name that again? Yes, it's, if you type Galleon project on the web, you will see lots of resources and lots of happy entrepreneurs doing kite surfing and videos, and you'll get lots of resources. So but you find that on Google, the Galleon project. Stéphane Renard, could you remind us the address of the site? Same thing, but I can write it, or we can share that by email if you don't find it, and it's really excellent. Okay, I think, are there some other questions? No, yeah, Isabel is typing the galleonproject.com, so it's even a website, and well, you will find it and enjoy it. It's very professional.
Okay, well, we still have a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions, this is the time to submit them. I would certainly like to thank Etienne, and it's great to be able to take advantage of his very rich experience. I mean, he said he was accompanying about 800 companies. I think it's important to know that entrepreneurship is really one of the pillars of HEC's strategy for the future. Fantastic things are happening on campus. There was studies about it 2 years ago or 3 years ago, which showed that about 25% of students finishing a degree program at HEC, whether that be the Grande École, one of the master's programs, executive education, or the MBA, 25% were creating their own company within the year of completion of their degree, which is just remarkable. So Etienne has mentioned during the webinar that networking is very important. Please be aware that the Alumni Association collaborates very, very closely with the school on all matters of entrepreneurship. It's a great way to mix generations and share expertise. And we have a number of entrepreneurship companies which may interest you if you have already set up your company or you're interested in it. We have seven entrepreneurship clubs. We have pitching events. We have mentoring sessions. Etienne mentioned one of his recommendations was that perhaps you should join the board of a company to gain some experience. Well, our governance club does offer opportunities and does try to identify opportunities for you to sit on a board. So please don't hesitate to get involved. And see what you can avail of, and it would help you. And I see that there's a new question there, Etienne, from Isabella.
Yeah, the question about the success rate, which is about, I think, 75 to 80% after 3 years, whereas it's really a Darwinian process among other startups. Normally, more than I think 50% of the SMEs disappear within 5 years, and for startups, it's even more ruthless. It's 90% disappear. So we have so far so good an outstanding success rate, but our selection rate is also very high because Antoine Leprêtre, who is the new boss of our incubator, has managed this so well that we now have a selection rate. So the next intake we have had 176 candidates for less than 10 slots. So our selection rate is higher than for the Grande École. So if we select good entrepreneurs, we have also, of course, so far so good, a better survival rate. But it's not a question only of surviving, it's a question of succeeding and finding the company you want to be in. But we are really happy in all our programs, executive MBA, Grande École, Masters, executive education to work with you. And as Janet told, we are also very active hubs. Laurent Didier is the president of our entrepreneurship hub with more than 2,000 members. And we try to connect the dots and to create some connections, business connections, finding associates, finding customers. And the HEC network is really huge. And our market share, as you said, Janet, is really huge. It's more than simply, well, I think for startups, it's between 10 and 15%. So, and the figure is still growing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. So I think, oh, well, Isabel is typing something. We'll see if if that question comes through. Thank you. That's very nice.
Well, thanks a lot.
So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Etienne, for sharing his experience with us. Before you leave, we'd be very grateful if you could just stay for one more minute and an evaluation is going to appear on your screen. This is something which is very useful for us because the feedback goes directly to Etienne and will help him to improve the webinar because it's something we do feel that we should repeat again and again in the future. So thank you very much for your time and we hope to see you again soon on another webinar.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.